Great. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Computer History Museum. Those online, those here in the audience, thank you so much for coming. My name's Dan Lewin. I'm the CEO of the museum. I've been here 7 years and a week. And this is the last program that I'll be opening for the museum. We've got a new CEO coming in if you follow on our online presence. Very excited about that and very excited about the program tonight. Sal and I met nearly 20 years ago. I was involved with another museum then where he came out, if you will, and Khan Academy was born. And it was an exciting road that they've been on, and we're really, really pleased about the topic tonight. If you haven't seen the chatbot exhibit downstairs, it ties in very nicely. Sal helped us with that and made some nice comments associated with it. Most people here know, if you've heard me speak or looked at the website, that this museum's mission has evolved over the last 7 years to focus on the broader implications of computing on the human condition. And there are many areas where computing can be applied, and if not education, we're missing the boat. And so tonight it's a really interesting conversation, and I think you're all going to walk away duly impressed. The museum's mission to shape a better future in terms of the broader purpose is grounded in the fact that history is really not about the past, it's about the present, because that's where we are, more or less, having a conversation with the past. And people do that typically to live and learn about things going forward. And so, Sal will be signing books later tonight. You'll have an opportunity to do that down in the lobby. And I'll make some closing remarks that include some things that Sal has said about the museum and his interest in partnering with us over time. So we want to thank him and the rest of the program tonight for picking the museum. But overarching all of that and this program is the generosity of our trustees and our members and our sponsors and our volunteers and the crew that puts these programs together. Tonight's program is sponsored by the McGovern Foundation. They're very generous in their support of the institution and in particular focused on the broader implications of AI, which we have been working on for 5 or 6 years. Going back to my initial tenure, we spent a lot of time thinking this through, anticipating it, but not knowing, as none of us did, the pace and scale with which things would come to light and show off in our daily lives. So with this, I want each of you to take a look on screen. There is a Slido, a little QR code that you can grab, and those online can do a similar thing. And if you don't have that access, you can type into slido.com. There's nothing to download, but it'll allow you to participate. And at the same time, because we're a learning institution and we have some federal grants, they're still holding true, for measuring and monitoring the impact that we have on our broader audience, both online and in present company. So if you would take the time, we'd appreciate that. So tonight, to introduce the speakers, I'm very pleased to ask Jill Bourne, who's the library director for the San Jose Library, to come on stage and tell us a little bit about Silicon Valley Reads and make an introduction to the program. So Jill?
Thank you.
Great, I'll talk to you later. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. I'm a children's librarian, so come on. Good evening, everyone. Yay! Thank you so much, Daniel, for welcoming us. And I am Jill Bourne. I'm the library director in San Jose. And I am part of the, one of the board chairs for Silicon Valley Reads, along with Jennifer Weeks from the Santa Clara County Library District. And Debbie Gorgulo from the County Office of Education, who is over here somewhere. So we say hi, Debbie. For 22 years, Silicon Valley Reads has been igniting conversations across Santa Clara County. And it is about reading, of course, but it's not just about reading. It's about connecting, understanding, and it's about building stronger communities through shared experiences. This year's theme, Empowering Humanity, Technology for a Better World, could not be more relevant today. We have a fantastic lineup of free events through March, which you can check out on our website. It includes insightful discussions like we're going to have tonight, as well as programs all across the county. So please take advantage of these robust calendars of events. So tonight, we're going to dive deep into technology with Sal Khan and his powerful new book, Brave New Words: How AI Will Revolutionize Education, and why that's a good thing. So Silicon Valley Reads is so honored to be co-hosting tonight's event and with the special speakers, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing them. So first up is Sal Khan. Sal is the founder and CEO of Khan Academy, a nonprofit educational organization that offers free lessons in math, science, and humanities, as well as tools for parents, teachers, and districts to track student progress. Khan Academy is piloting an AI guide called Khanmigo that is a tutor and teaching assistant. Worldwide, Khan Academy has more than 170 million registered users in 190 countries, with free lessons available in more than 50 languages. Please join me in welcoming Sal Khan.
Thank you.
Okay, and here to moderate the conversation is Rachel Myrow. Rachel is a senior editor of KQED's Silicon Valley News Desk, reporting on topics like what big tech sees in President Trump, California's many AI bills, and the lost sounds of San Francisco. You can hear her work on NPR, The World, WBUR's Here and Now, and the BBC. She also guest hosts for KQED's Forum. Please join me in welcoming Rachel Myrow. Thank you so much. Have fun.
Okay. All righty then. Well, thank you to Daniel and Jill. I am so excited for this conversation. No one understands where education is headed better than Sal. Now, I'm hoping you all have already dug into this book and read it after tonight, if not before, because it's been out for a while. But really, my other hope for tonight is that you don't walk away having decided that AI in education is a good thing or a bad thing, because that ship has already sailed, am I right? We're about to discuss it. What I want us to talk together tonight about is what AI is doing in education now and where we can or should direct its direction. But first, Slido question number 1. Some of you have already started, I hope, participating. Let's make a word cloud. What word comes top of mind for the use of AI in education to you? Is it cheating, democratizing, immersive, impairing? Tell us your word, and remember there are filters to prevent swearing. But I'm guessing for some of the younger members in the audience, just the fact that you have a parent sitting nearby will keep us, on the straight and narrow. Well, it looks like transformative, which I think is a really good one so far. So, Sal, I'm guessing even the grown-ups in this audience, and certainly the kids, are already playing with or working with some model. Maybe it's GPT-4. Can I have a show of hands? How about Grok, Llama, Falcon, Mistral? This is, after all, the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, right? I'm in the right place. So Sal, give us the one-pager, and I do mean one-pager, about Khanmigo. How is Khanmigo different from, say, ChatGPT-4?
Yeah, and it's first, great to be here, and I'm a big fan, so it's fun to meet in person. I think I mean, you just throw out, there's a lot of words, and people think about large language models, and they hear things like GPT-4 and Llama, and then they hear these other things like ChatGPT. And just to get everyone on the same page, I'm sure a lot of people are already familiar, is you have these underlying models, and then you have applications that are built on it. So a lot of times people will use things like GPT-4 and ChatGPT interchangeably. But just to get a little bit more precise, what it is GPT-4 is the underlying model, and ChatGPT is an application that you can use to interface with GPT-4 or GPT 3.5 or whatever other model it is. So one, at a very basic level, Khanmigo is actually a set of applications that are built off of different models. We started with GPT-4, but over time, it's likely to be many different ones. And one theme that I keep telling myself, I remember 2.5 years ago, I write about this in the book, I didn't think for sure generative AI was going to be a big part of Khan Academy's future. I had kept track of some of what was going on with GPT 1, 2, and 3. It was cool, but not, it had issues. It didn't look like it could really handle real knowledge, make sense of things.
There's that hallucinatory thing.
And GPT, people now for, GPT 2 and even to some degree 3 was even worse than that. It really didn't even make sense. They would make a grammatical sentences, but once you get a few sentences into it, it wouldn't even be able to follow a train of thought. And so in summer of 2022, Sam Altman and Greg Brockman sent me an email, and they said, hey, we have our new model. And I was like, oh, that's probably GPT-4. We'd like to see if it's of interest for y'all at Khan Academy. And we get, almost on a daily basis, 3 or 4 people saying, hey, we have this new thing. Do you want to? And we kind of like, oh, it's probably not going to be anything. But I knew Sam and Greg and OpenAI. I'm like, okay, this is probably at least interesting, whether or not we're going to be able to use it. But when they showed me and our chief learning officer what would become GPT-4, and this was summer of 2022. This was about 5 months before ChatGPT came out. I could talk more about it. ChatGPT was actually a surprise for everyone. ChatGPT wasn't built even on GPT-4. But when we saw what it was and the fact that it could seemingly reason, and it could, with a little bit of prompting, you could have it take on the persona of, say, a tutor or a teaching assistant, we said, well, this could change. It could be transformative. It could change everything. At the same time, we said, well, but it could also be used for cheating. It was awfully bad at math for a computer, for software. It was hallucinating. It was making up facts. I remember that first weekend we were looking for a CFO at Khan Academy, and I just assumed it was somehow connected to the internet. And I said, hey, can you find some potential CFOs for Khan Academy? And it produced 3 resumes for me, and I'm like, this is unbelievable. Like, 2 of them live walking distance from our office, and like I couldn't have.
Unbelievable is right.
It was unbelievable, complete hallucinations. So then we started having all the same debates at Khan Academy that, frankly, the world is still struggling with. But I encourage, and I write a lot about this in the book, I encourage the teams, like, look, we can't shy away from this. This is where the future is going. We have to think about what is our true north as an organization. I think that's very important, especially in times of change, especially when the technology seems to be changing every week. What's your true north? Our true north has always been, how do we, our mission is free world-class education for anyone, anywhere. I got started, many people know, by tutoring family. Word spreads in my family, free tutoring is going on. Before I know it, I'm making videos for them, exercises. So the true north has always been world-class as rigor, et cetera, but it's also, in my mind, personalization. What I was able to do with my cousins, being able to tutor them, speed up, slow down, fill in gaps, motivate based on their interests. I always say, and I mentioned this in the book, Alexander the Great, if you were a prince for most of human history, you got very good personalized tutoring. Alexander the Great had Aristotle as his personal tutor, pretty good. But in the last 200-300 years, we have mass public education. We had to compromise. We couldn't do that anymore. And so everything Khan Academy has always been about is, well, can we start to leverage technology to approximate elements of personalized tutoring, personalized education, and do it at scale. And we've done it over the years with videos and exercises and articles. And so our true north has always been, wow, that's what we want to do. Maybe AI can help us there, be another support. And we also realized maybe it can help teachers, because we realize teachers are a very big part of the process with lesson planning and progress report writing and grading papers eventually. So long answer to simple question, what's Khanmigo? At the very high level, it's to be a tutor and aid for students learning, and to be an aid and tutor and a teaching assistant for teachers. But to some degree, that's just to map it to some models that we already understand. But I think, and it's already happening, that it's actually going to, in some ways it'll never be able to do what human beings are doing, but in other areas, it's actually going to be able to do things that I could have never done for my cousins, where it could simulate a historic figure, or it could facilitate a conversation, or run a simulation, or always be available for students. But that's what it is today, and it's evolving very fast.
And just in case one or two of you hasn't actually played with it already, Conmigo won't give you the answer.
Yeah, so there's several guardrails there. The first one is, we are trying to do, if my cousins 20 years ago said, hey, Sal, can you just do my homework for me? I'd be like, no, that's not going to be good for you. So Conmigo will do the same thing. I do demos and kids say, like, give me the answer? And it says, well, I'm not here for you to give you the answer, et cetera. I'm here to support you. It's very Socratic. People will notice a very big difference. You mentioned the difference between ChatGPT. ChatGPT is a very ask and it responds. Conmigo is very conversational, very Socratic. If you ask it something like, you say you're watching a Khan Academy video and you're like, why do I need to learn this? It'll ask, well, what do you care about? And it'll actually remember. If you say, well, I want to be a professional athlete, or I want to be a doctor, or whatever else. And we want it over time to be better and better and better at the types of things that a real tutor would be, where it's not just about answering questions, it's about driving the conversation, asking questions yourself, and then also having a long-lasting narrative relationship with the learner and helping him stay on track.
And it reports back to the teacher if a student is struggling or cheating.
Yeah, look, this is, as soon as you say you're working with students, K-12, all of the cheating is one red flag. What if students do shady things with it? Cheating's one, but it could also be unhealthy conversations. I want to learn how to build a bomb, or or I want to hurt someone, or and so that's where when we launched, we took the most conservative route, which I think is right, which is teachers and administrators for under 18 users have access to the transcripts. They can even get summaries, ask the AI. It's just, a teaching assistant and a tutor doesn't have to be different things. It's actually ideal if they're the same entity. And so if I'm tutoring you, it's really useful for your teachers to be able to ask me, what have you been talking about with Myra? And I was like, oh, we did this, we did that, and she's struggling a little bit here, but she's really into this. So maybe when we plan lessons together, and by the way, Myra and 10 other kids are really into this, the Golden State Warriors. Let's make a lesson around that. So yeah, we've tried to put the guardrails. We have another AI that's moderating the conversations. It sends messages to administrators if anything suspicious is going on. And to your point about keeping kids honest, cheating, especially with writing, is a lot of big risk. And we just launched something called Writing Coach, and there was a 60 Minutes piece about 2 months ago on this. Anderson Cooper intentionally tried to cheat on a 7th grade essay he had written about his mother, Gloria Vanderbilt. And so he got to ChatGPT for part of it, and it caught him. And the way that it caught him, anyone who tells you that they can detect AI is actually selling you snake oil. You really can't. The false positive rate is very high. But the way you can get closer to it is by looking at the process. So ideally, the AIs are there to support the students, not do the work, and then report the process to the teacher. And if the AI sees that a chunk of text has been copied and pasted at some point, and it wasn't even part of the process, and it looks a little bit different than the rest, then the AI can tell the teacher, hey, I don't know where this came from. I'm not going to make a false allegation. Maybe the student was ethical, but you should introspect on this part right here. And look, cheating, I have a whole chapter in the book on cheating. And every chapter in the book, I always start with like, okay, here's this fear of AI. And before I even get into AI, I was like, well, hasn't this been a problem even before AI? And you do a little bit of research. It's not hard to find that cheating has always existed, and unfortunately, it's gotten worse since we were in school. It's almost become normed in certain circles,
especially during the pandemic. Yeah.
During the pandemic, there's Stanford. I write about Stanford had I think an honor code that was so far that it actually undermined trust with faculty, where faculty weren't allowed to be in the room when a test was administered. But then you have this rampant phenomenon. Like, look, even in a class of 300, if 5 kids are openly cheating and you're not, you don't know what to do, because you could tell on those kids and then risk their whole future. They get expelled, and then you get, or you do nothing and you feel like you're at a disadvantage. And unfortunately, this has been going on at even top universities. So that's existed. It's not hard, and I write about this in the book. There are websites that have existed for 20 years that for $5 a page, a PhD in Kenya, it will write your papers for you, guaranteed A-, A+, whatever.
I know a couple of people who met their wives or future partners and endeared themselves by writing papers for them.
That's even better compensation. But yeah, so these things have always, and to some degree, AI has just put a spotlight and leveled the playing field. And this notion of a process and surfacing the process to the teacher, this would have always been a good solution, but now it's front and center for everyone.
So you've been at this for a couple of years now. More than 450,000 students and teachers are piloting Conmigo in more than 400 school districts and schools across the country. How's it going?
Yeah, it's been fascinating. A couple of things that are maybe surprising. When we initially were talking to OpenAI 2.5 years ago, we signed all these non-disclosure agreements, et cetera. We were going to launch the same day that they were going to launch GPT-4, which was scheduled to be March of 2023. And then all of a sudden, November 29th, this thing called ChatGPT comes out. And that was the day, many of y'all might remember those few weeks, the whole world started like, what is this thing? AI is here. And I was really worried because we were putting all these guardrails, trying to think about it, because we knew that it had real issues, especially the model that ChatGPT launched on, which is GPT 3.5. And I remember messaging the leadership team, like, what are y'all doing? Y'all have us lawyered up with this non-disclosure agreement. It's like the biggest secret we ever had to keep. And now you just launched something. They're like, we didn't launch anything. They said, we just launched a bunch of apps on top of our old model. And one of them just happened to be this chat interface and called ChatGPT. And everyone kind of latched onto it. And even OpenAI was completely shocked that ChatGPT was anything. They thought that GPT-4 launch was going to be the big moment. I was really bummed because, like, okay, people are going to throw out the baby with the bathwater, the cheating's obvious, et cetera, et cetera. And you did see school districts start banning these tools, and I'm like, okay, this is going to be horrible. The first impression's really bad. The good thing is when we launched, to some degree, even in those few months, people had come full circle. They'd said, well, it has issues, but if only there were the right guardrails, if only it was pedagogically focused, if only it was kind of safe and there was transparency. So when we launched Conmigo, we were actually bracing ourselves for a lot of people saying, like, oh, this is imperfect. It can, we minimize the math errors, we minimize the hallucinations, but it's still not perfect. And so we were expecting some pushback, but people say, oh, this is a lot better than all these other things we were worried about. So that was actually the first surprising win. And these numbers, and for next school year, it's probably going to be on the order of like 1.1 million students and teachers formally using it in school systems. I would say just systemically, before I talk about some of the things we've learned from Conmigo, when we launched, many of y'all know that there's a lot of computation involved with these frontier models, these fairly complex large language models. And so we thought just the computation cost was going to be $50, $60 per user per year. And so we had to pass that on. Our mission is free world-class education, but the marginal cost there was very high. And so even then, more districts than we expected signed on. If you asked me then where we would be now, I'd say maybe we'd be at like 50 or 100,000, not 1.1 million. And part of that is the pull has been stronger than expected, but also the costs have been coming down dramatically, which is great. By next year, it's going to be around $10 per student per year. So it's coming down dramatically. What we've learned, and I think we're seeing this in the broader world, well, one, I'll start on the teacher side. The stereotype of education is that it's oftentimes the last thing to embrace innovation and that it can be kind of slow moving. I actually think teachers generally, whether using Conmigo or not, are actually some of the fastest early adopters of using generative AI because it's such a natural use case. And the teacher tools that we have out there for like teachers co-editing lesson plans or co-creating content or writing progress reports, those are very, very, very popular. And that's bigger uptake than we expected. On the student side, what we're seeing, and this was a little bit surprising, there's about 15, 20% of students who immediately get it. They always wanted to ask the questions. They just never had anyone or anything to ask the questions to. And it really is, as far as we can tell, we're starting to run some efficacy studies supporting them. The other 85% of students, they're either not used to being in a position to just ask questions, or they've already disengaged, or they just don't know how. But once again, this is a situation where like, oh no, this is not good. Like, what are we going to do? But then teachers are telling, no, but it's those same students who have trouble raising their hand and asking a question in class. And actually, they like the fact that they can get practice in this form. But a lot of what we've learned from that is how can we get easier on-ramps? So how do we make the AI more? We have a project inside of Khan Academy called Proactive Conmigo. Do we make, when I tutored my cousins, I didn't just, call them up and just wait for them to ask me something. I would proactively say, hey, Nadia, okay, so how's it doing? Did you do that thing? How hard was it? All right, were you able to do this? Here's another one that's a little bit more challenging. So we have a lot of things in the works, especially for next year, where Conmigo is going to be much more proactive. Based on what it's doing, it's going to surface many more insights to teachers, like, hey, you might want to talk to these 5 students about this. You might want to incorporate this into tomorrow's lesson plan because of what I learned talking to these 20 students.
You mentioned cost a little bit earlier. Bear with an old business reporter. Khan Academy is free, but Conmigo?
Yeah, Conmigo, so I'll give the whole is not free, and I'll give the whole, our mission is free world-class education for anyone, anywhere. At the same time, Khan Academy's never been free to build. We have a team, we've gone fully remote now, but our headquarters is still down the street here, about a mile and a half near downtown. And our budget is now pushing $80–90 million a year. So it's a real budget, and it gives me a little anxiety every time I say that, because most of it is raised philanthropically. But I remind anyone who's in the giving mood, that's the budget of a large high school, and we're reaching a large chunk of humanity. But with that said, we spend of that $90 million, $7 million before AI was about server costs, just people coming and using the site, et cetera, et cetera. AI, I'll tell you two things. About 7 years ago, before AI, we started going to school districts and saying, look at our efficacy studies. I think we're the most studied platform of it. If kids put even an hour a week, they grow 30, 40, 50% more than expected. We're free. Why don't you use us more often in your district? And look, a lot of teachers are already using it. And every superintendent and chief academic officer was always the same thing. They're like, oh, we believe you. You got my daughter through the SAT, or you even helped me through graduate school. But if you want us to use you, you have to give us support and integration with our rostering systems, district dashboards, training, et cetera. And so that was the first time we're like, okay, if we're serious about moving the dial, we have to build that muscle. But the marginal cost there is much higher than even that $7 million of server costs. You have to send people on a plane to train and do some bespoke IT. So that's when we started what we call our Khan Academy district offering. So we always have the free offering, but then when districts want this, we started charging them $10 to $15 a year for that. And then when AI came out, and we said, look, we're not in it to get any margin. We're primarily funded with philanthropy, but we can't take on this cost. So we started just passing it through to them. The cost came down, and then Microsoft gave us a huge $32 million compute grant last May. And so between the cost coming down and that's how we've been able to bring down kind of just throw it into the district offering now.
We know so much of the educational experience is problematic, and this was true even before the pandemic, even before AI. But we want children to learn how to think critically and to learn how to express themselves. And my worry, perhaps some of you share it, is that AI promises children and grown-ups, hey, don't worry, I'll do the hard thinking for you.
Yeah, look, I think every time you have a wave of technology that is assistive in some way, there's a little bit of that fear. I write about it in the book. A calculator comes out, people are like, oh, no one's going to learn arithmetic anymore. No one needs to learn. But actually, it turns out that the people who really are able to be amplified with a calculator are those who actually know their arithmetic really well. Similarly, when computers and then the internet and web search came out, people are like, oh, no one needs to have content knowledge anymore. You can just Google anything that you need to know. Well, it turns out that even to be in a position where you can use search and internet to be part of the knowledge economy, you have to have a lot of knowledge. And people with knowledge are actually better at searching, et cetera, et cetera. And we're seeing the same thing with generative AI. You know, that 15–20% of students that are really getting the most of it are actually the ones that have enough background knowledge to know how to push the AI, to know what a good answer looks like, to know when it's being useful, and to be able to even articulate their own questions. So yes, you know, I talk a lot about it in the book. Technology always amplifies intent. Fire can burn, fire can heal. Depends what your intent is. AI is no different, although it might be a little bit transcendent into certain dimensions. But there's definitely people with bad intent. We could talk about those folks, you know, fraud, deepfakes, et cetera. There's people with lazy intent. These are, you know, a student who just wants to not do their homework, et cetera, et cetera. Once again, they always found ways, oftentimes. This might be a little bit easier. And then there's people with positive intent. I want to learn, I want to do the ethical thing, et cetera, et cetera. So my view is, and this goes back to some of those guardrails, yes, you can oftentimes use the technology to put guardrails around the people with not positive intent, either the negative intent or the lazy intent. And that's where some of that policing and the transparency and all of that's around. But as far as I can tell now, and look, it's hard to predict exactly where this is going. Who would have thought 20 years ago that I would have said social media is great. We can all publish stuff and share and stay connected with family and friends. And you can do all of those things. But obviously, it's led to a lot of other things that aren't as positive. But there's two things, at least two things that give me a lot of hope with this next push. One is, in the social media world, the Instagrams, Facebooks, Googles, YouTubes, whatever of the world, there was plausible deniability. Like, hey, we just made a platform, people upload it. Yeah, we did create this algorithm that really is to keep you clicking on ads, and it just turns out that it makes you click on things that's more polarizing or makes you anxious, but that's not our content. And you know, and it honestly is. I don't want to be too disparaging, because it isn't easy to pick like, oh, we're gonna not let that person post, but we will let that person post. It's hard to sometimes draw the line there. But that has led to this previous generation of AIs feeding all of our minds these things that are addictive but aren't necessarily good for us. With generative AI, and we've already seen it, if Gemini or ChatGPT gives something that's clearly biased or wrong or embarrassing, those companies, these billion, trillion-dollar companies, get embarrassed by it. So I think there's a nice accountability loop, the way that we haven't seen before. And the other thing is, you know, interfacing, at least right now, I'm sure people are going to figure out ways to make generative AI more addictive and maybe less healthy. I know there's going to be online, I mean, there already are generative AI boyfriends and girlfriends, and it's, you know, we can debate. I have a friend who invested in, he's very defensive about when he invested in the company. He's like, well, when I invested, they were using generative AI to help refugees find like programs. And they quickly pivoted to a generative AI girlfriend. And my friend's very defensive, although I think his valuation has gone up. And he's like, and then even then I'm like, well, and it's a very attractive generative AI girlfriend. And he's like, yeah, but you know, it turns out that most of the time people are just wanting someone to talk to. 5% they want something else, but most of the time they just want something to talk to. So anyway, I don't know if that's going to turn out positive or negative or someplace weird in between. But I would say that, you know, the interactions that you have with Conmigo, et cetera, even those early days when I was interacting with, you know, GPT-4 before people had access, I found them, they did not feel to me like, oh, I just wasted 20 minutes on TikTok. They felt much more like, wow, that was a really stimulating, thought-provoking back and forth. I was able to ask some really edge case questions. It pushed my thinking. And I'll just say one last thing. A lot of people are afraid that it'll undermine creativity, et cetera. And I always try to map AI and say, okay, well, let's put the technology aside. Let's just imagine in the real world, if you're my friend and you're super creative, there's two things I could do. I could either say, Myra, can you just do this essay for me? And then it undermines my creativity. Or you're creative, let's bounce ideas off of each other, and we'll both become more creative. And I think there's ways to push people to that second use case. If you think, any time that any of us have been the most creative, I think we've been around other creative people. And obviously the ideal is to have other people around, be it a coffee shop in Paris or, be in Florence during the Renaissance or Silicon Valley right now and have people that you can collaborate with. But most kids in the world don't have that. And so, we have another platform called schoolhouse.world, which is real, live, peer-to-peer interactions over Zoom. So hopefully you have that too. But if you're just really curious about something and you want to go bounce ideas, generative AI can be pretty powerful.
Slido question number 2. If you've seen a young child using AI before, or perhaps you are a young child using AI now, did you feel they were using AI for good, mixed bag, or for ill? You can be honest now. Let's see what we have here. Woo, mixed bag.
Mixed bag.
This reminds me, I conducted an unscientific survey of my 2 nephews, and one of them said he's worried he's becoming too reliant on it, AI, and, quote, a lot of kids use it so much to do their homework, and especially their papers, that I think they lose those skills entirely.
Yeah, well, it's a hard message too, and I read a lot about this because.
And he's a smarty pants,
Oh,
by
I'm
the
sure.
way, sophomore at a good university.
So I think there's 2 things. We're very reliant on the internet now. We're very reliant on computers now, and I almost have trouble imagining what someone did in a desk job before there was the internet and computers and Slack and et cetera, et cetera. So we're all reliant on a lot of different things, and that might be okay as long as we have access to those things. And if anything, just as 5 years ago, if you're hiring someone for a white-collar job and they're like, what's PowerPoint? I've never used it. Or how do you type in a document? Or what's a spreadsheet? You'll be like, oh, I don't know if this job's for you. Same thing now, if someone's like, oh, I'm against using generative AI at work. You're like, no. If you really want to get productive as a software engineer, as a writer, or as a grant writer, I'm encouraging every day folks at Khan Academy to use it in thoughtful ways to improve their output. I think there's a couple of things. I think there's a lot of educators who are a little bit of denial right now. Some will say, oh, I can detect AI. I'm like, no, you can't. They usually can if the student is very non-artful about how they use it. If they just say, ChatGPT, write this paper, and you just copy and paste that in, most professors are like, hey, this feels a little stilted, et cetera, et cetera. But if you say, hey, ChatGPT, here's a few paragraphs of my last paper. Can you write a paper that gives me an A- to B+, and put a few errors in there, a few grammatical errors? Done.
Or they'll just, massage.
A massage.
Yeah, any 11-year-old knows that you can,
exactly.
turn it into something.
And actually even more problematic is a lot of educators are actually there's these sites, GPT-0 and Zero GPT, they're 2 different sites. They claim to be able to detect AI writing. And what's bad about these is they have a very high false positive rate, 30, 40% false positive rates. And so there's actually an epidemic of students getting falsely accused of cheating. And I've seen this actually, my own 13-year-old daughter told me this, and I heard this from college students too. They're writing their papers and then using AI to introduce errors so their teacher doesn't think that AI wrote their paper. That's the world that we're now.
We're training them essentially to
exactly.
do that.
So it's important for everyone to be informed first of what can. But my advice on the writing is more in-class writing, which I think has always been a good idea because you can be supported. The teacher gets a much better read about what's going on because as soon as you take it home, who's your parents? How much are they supporting you, et cetera? It becomes a huge unlevel playing field. I think the other extreme, especially with older students, high school, college, use whatever you can. Use ChatGPT, but instead of writing the business plan, I want you to start the business. Instead of just writing a paper and looking up stuff in an encyclopedia, I want you to go and interview people and town hall, do some investigative journalism. And so, yeah, you need to write something at the end of the day. And even then, you need to know what great writing looks like so that you can keep tweaking the prompts to get something really good. But you're also going to have to go, go meet people, talk to people, interview people, and ChatGPT is not going to do, or AI is not going to do that. And I think then the middle ground is we still want students to be able to do these traditional term paper type things. They should be able to do it independently. They should be able to do the writing themselves. And that's where we've been building things like Writing Coach, where the teacher creates the assignment with the AI administers the assignment, it's there to assist them, like an ethical parent would, but it's the student's work, and then it shares the output and the process and flags anything that might be a little bit off with the teacher.
Well, you've already anticipated where I wanted to go next, which is how education has to evolve given the fact that kids are using AI one way or another, using Conmigo or something else. So let's imagine a future some people already have where, there aren't any more take-home papers. They all have to be written in the class with a human being watching over, not like at Stanford. Or maybe sort of like Oxford and Cambridge, when it comes to exam time, kids have to orally defend their line of argument.
Yeah, I think that's where we're going. And look, we're still going to have this writing coach use case where you write with the AI, and so I think that will be a useful one. But with all things, it's always good to take a step back. It's like, what is the purpose of papers to begin with? I do think, and I can list some. In certain cases, the papers to learn how to make a structured argument, learn grammar, maybe practice some vocabulary. In certain cases, it's to do research. In certain cases, it's proof that you interacted with some reading or writing. We can all remember the book report. And so I think there's still going to be value in writing these papers, but I think there's also value in other modalities that when the term paper first became a thing, I don't know, 200 years ago, or maybe even 2,000 years ago, you didn't have things like on-demand video. You didn't have computers. You didn't have AI. And so, for example, we have a virtual school that we started with Arizona State University called Khan World School. And there, when the students read a book, and this was before AI, we're probably going to retool it a little bit with AI, there's some questions that they have to just reflect on video. On like that chapter of like, hey, why did they think the Great Gatsby did this? And how do you feel about this and that? And you could imagine a world where even AI could interview you in real time about how you felt about that. And that actually would be, I think, a much stronger signal of maybe comprehension of the book. Because you can't fake that. You can't ask your older sister, hey, can you write this for me? Or just purely go to Cliff Notes. I mean, you could probably still cheat a little bit. But it's you talking about what you just read. So I think that's another dimension that you might have. One thing that we are working on at Khan Academy is the future of assessment. A lot of, there's all these really important traits in life. How well do you communicate? Your sense of humor, creativity, your interpersonal skills that show up nowhere on your transcript. It doesn't show on your SAT score. It doesn't show up on your grades. And the reason it doesn't is it's hard to measure objectively. And so it doesn't show up in standardized tests. And so the standardized tests can only narrowly measure some multiple choice stuff, and so that's what a lot of people index on. But there is a world, and we have to be very careful with bias, et cetera, that you could, in theory, start to, you could give a speech and have the AI give you feedback on your speech, and even have a little bit of an evaluation on, like, Myra's really great at impromptu whatever, but she could do better at research, et cetera. So I think things like that actually will come, and it's just a matter of getting them right. And for people who are worried, and I am too, about bias and et cetera, I always say there's nothing that's perfect, and actually bias is always considered a bad word, but there's some good biases you want. You want someone who's hardworking, someone who's going to be a good fit for the job. You want to be biased on those dimensions. But what we're comparing against is the today, which is humans. And humans are incredibly, incredibly biased. I mean, there have been studies that the same person will rate the same candidate differently depending on what they had for lunch, or depending on whether they interview him in the morning or whether they interview him in the evening. And then you could only, and it's very hard to benchmark, but we all can tell that sometimes if you feel more connected to the person, you went to the same college, you have shared experience, you probably have a little bit more bias towards them. And so, with AI, you can start to test these. So anyway, I think the question about the types of projects and stuff, I think it's the whole spectrum. I think AI has the opportunity to give more transparency and also open up the aperture so it's not just written and pencil and paper. It could be things that are based on videos, performative. It could even be based on interactions between two people and giving both people feedback, things like that.
How do you imagine this all playing out when, especially in this country, we have, people cling tightly to hyper-local control over education, especially. The lower the grade, the more they cling. And oftentimes because they want to enforce a certain set of social prejudices, you know, do you see a way in which Conmigo can help to offset especially the more regressive, you know, school districts?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's actually a question that we've had even before AI, where people say, I mean, Khan Academy does have courses in American history, world history, civics, et cetera, and people have always asked me this question, and maybe I'm just, you know, naive here, but we've actually gotten very little pushback, and we're heavily used. In fact, if anything, some of our highest per capita usage is, you know, it's in red states or purple states. It's not necessarily in places like California, and you know, what I think people can be excited about is the internet and social media tends to be very polarizing. But the reality is, people in, you know, if I were to stereotype, people in Texas will think, oh, people in California are doing nothing but social justice, and they're not talking about there's really things to be proud of this country. And yes, the founders of this country have some sins that, you know, but you also need to think about it in context. They did some great things. They laid the underpinnings so that we could, and people in California, if the stereotype, will often think, oh, those people in Texas don't want to teach about slavery. They don't want to teach about the civil rights movement. And the reality is, actually, I think about 95% of Americans are actually completely fine teaching both. And we see this on Khan Academy. We've had, I remember when we first released our American history and our civics, and we just launched a course with the National Constitution Center called Constitution 101. We had a Trump-appointed federal court judge who was very skeptical. Hey, what's this thing coming out of Northern California? Looked at our content. This is great. It's teaching the Constitution. It's teaching the underpinnings, et cetera, et cetera. And then we had someone who's on the state regents in New York, who's a former civil rights activist. Said, okay, hey, I want to make sure you're not, you know, covering up some of the dark. Looked at the same course and said, oh, this is good. You're not covering up anything. So I think as long as it's a superset and you're steering clear of what either side might be perceived as an indoctrination in some cases, you're actually fine. And I'll tell you, I have a friend who runs another nonprofit, and she got a grant in order to do a study. You know, there's the 1776 curriculum, and then there's the 1608 project, and there's some curricula that's developed around that. And her grant was to figure out what's the difference. 90% overlap between the two. So it's not as different as people think. Now, how it's implemented in certain classrooms, there probably are classrooms in California that fit the stereotype of what the Texans think, and there probably are some classrooms in Texas that fit the stereotype. But they're less mainstream. And frankly, there's probably classrooms in California that meet the Texas stereotype, and there's classrooms in Texas, vice versa. So going to AI, this is something, you know, you could test a lot and how it handles these. We've been pretty impressed. And we had a reporter skeptical. I said, you try it out. Don't believe me. And so he goes on to Conmigo, and he took on the persona, I think this is probably his own point of view, of someone who's very pro-gun control. And he immediately asked Conmigo, hey, you know, the Second Amendment makes no sense anymore. People are dying. Like we've got to put some limits on guns. And Conmigo, and I point out, if you go into many, let's say, left-leaning communities, the likely reaction from the teacher might be, I agree with you. I can't believe that there are people who disagree. And if you go into a right-leaning classroom, the teacher might say, how dare you say that? Don't you understand? It's not the guns that are killing. I have a gun. You know, everyone in my family, we don't do these things. These are other people that are getting illegally, et cetera. Conmigo did neither of those things. It did what I think is the right answer. Conmigo didn't immediately validate or invalidate the bias that the question asker was asking. It said, well, before we get into right or wrong, why do you think the founders put the Second Amendment into the Constitution? And so the reporter's like, oh, okay, he's making me do work. Oh, well, you know, it was right after the Revolutionary War, and the British didn't like us having a militia, and, you know, didn't like us keeping arms in our houses, so we felt that we needed to do that in order to, and then reported, but, you know, a musket is very different than a semi-automatic weapon, and you know, we have a police force and a military now, we don't need that. And then Conmigo didn't say amen. It didn't say, how dare you say that? It said, well, before we get into that, why do you think the Second Amendment has persisted? So it's doing what I think a great teacher should do, which is push you on your critical thinking. So no matter where you're coming at, it's just pushing you on it. And then later it asks, so what are some arguments that you think someone who is against gun control would give? And so it's forcing you to build some empathy and put yourself in other people's shoes, which is actually what the learning experience should be about. So I feel, we did have a situation, we have this activity where you can chat with AI simulations of historical figures. And there was one edge case that hit very quickly where someone asked AI Thomas Jefferson about gay marriage. And so that's where, we're like, there's no right answer here because, I could imagine, so we put a constraint that the AI can only weigh in on topics that that character would have had context on, or that there's evidence that they had a point of view on. And so now if you ask AI Thomas Jefferson, it's like, well, that's not an issue that I'm really familiar with, et cetera. I'm not the best person to ask about that, things like that. But for the most part, it's out there. I mean, it's the same thing. I said the raw models, if Google's model or Microsoft's or OpenAI does something embarrassing, it's on them. Same thing on Conmigo. It's being out there, millions of folks using it. If it did something that's clearly biased, it's egg on our face. So I think the incentives are very clear. But so far, it's, I think, handled it very well.
So just before I launch into the Q&A with our audience questions that we've been receiving, one last question from somebody who is a natural-born disruptor in the best sense of the word. What do you make of what's happening right now in Washington, D.C. to the Department of Education?
Oh, OK. I was preparing myself for a broader commentary. I hope this isn't a political statement. I think we should leave the Canadians alone. They're very nice people. That shouldn't be controversial.
One would think.
One would think. I think
Yeah.
let them have their country. So the Department of Education. So I think what I've told our, I get questions all the time I get it asked almost on a weekly basis from our own team, like how is this going to affect us, et cetera, et cetera. And what I point out is that education is mainly a state and local thing. And so the Department of Education, which really came about it's a fairly late phenomenon in our history. It's in the 1970s type of thing. It really, depending on the state, it's about 5 to 20% of funding. In places like New York and California, it's closer to 5–10% of funding. And it's a higher percentage of actually places like Mississippi and Alabama because their absolute value is, absolute funding is lower, so the amount you get from the federal government's a larger chunk, and there's more kids in poverty, et cetera. And a lot of that funding is for very, programs like free lunch, et cetera, et cetera. There's another element of the loans, et cetera. It's still to be, there's the optics of dismantling the Department of Education, which seems to be like a checkbox. And then there's the other question of, is it eliminating everything, or is it just putting it in other places? So I was just reading that the student loan stuff might go to the Treasury Department. So that's just a movement of responsibility from one government agency to another government agency. That probably it's going to be dependent on how it gets implemented. Who knows? In general, though, yes. I'll never say that education is a bad place to put more resources in. At the same time, I think it is healthy to look, and this isn't the Department of Education. I think even at a local level, it's good to see where the dollars are going. I point out, California, depending on the school district, is spending $20,000 to $30,000 per student per year. New York City spends $40,000 per student per year. New York City, for example, they have a decent ratio, 25 to 1, but 25 to 1, $40,000, that's $1 million per classroom per year, if you just view it that way. The teacher's not getting paid that. Fully loaded cost of the teacher with benefits, even if they're a senior teacher, et cetera, maybe it's pushing 150, 200 in the most idealistic with all the benefits, everything, pensions in there. So, where are all the other resources going? And some of it makes sense. You need special needs, and you have this, and you have facilities, et cetera. But there's also a lot of bureaucracy that's not touching students. So, my view is for those who are super worried about the Department of Education being dismantled, I think because it's predominantly a state and local thing, it's not something to necessarily think that the education system is going to get completely dismantled. At the same time, for those who are overly flip about oh, it's fine, it'll just go away. No, it'll probably have some edge cases that we're going to have to plan for. And I would get, my gut sense is in certain places, The states are going to states and local governments are going to pick up the slack. And in other places like Alabama, it's going to be very hard to.
Well, let's throw the conversation to the audience. I'll start with another tough question. This one from Adolph. With AI enabling real-time personalized learning, do you think the need for traditional education, school, college, will diminish, or will they adapt in new ways?
Good question, and I'll tell you the answer that people have asked some version of this question for as long as Khan Academy has existed, because even in the early days when we have videos and this personalized software, and I always used to read testimonials about kids all over the world who are able to use Khan Academy, and just 2 weeks ago I was virtually talking to a group of students at MIT, and there was a young girl in a room who's a freshman, and it turns out that she grew up in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, wasn't allowed to go to school, and Khan Academy was her school. And then we have this platform, schoolhouse.world, where not only can you get tutoring, but you can certify your knowledge to become a tutor. And MIT and Caltech and UChicago and Yale and a bunch of schools like that are willing to use that in lieu of an SAT or an AP score. And she did that, and she got into MIT from Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. So when people hear that, that's great, but they're like, oh, well, did she need a teacher? Well, my view is, in an ideal world, she would have had an amazing, and maybe she did implicitly have people in her family or other people who are supporting her, but I am excited about the ability to be a bit of a safety net for people like her. If you're in rural Alaska and there's not a calculus class within 100 miles for that, or even if you're in Mountain View and for whatever reason your chemistry class isn't registering with you, we want to be that safety net. But our ideal is you do have access to amazing, not just teacher, but community and classroom environment. I've always said if I had to pick between amazing teacher and amazing technology for myself or my own kids, I would pick amazing teacher every time. But ideally, we don't have to make that trade-off, because an amazing teacher with infinite resources and working with you one-on-one can do amazing things. And actually, even then, you could probably benefit from having a social and peers to deal with other things in life. But we know that that's not the reality. Most even amazing teachers are in classrooms of 25, 30, 35 with kids all over at different levels with different gaps. How do we use technology to assist them, to personalize things more? Similarly, if you're upper middle class, you can afford tutors for your kids. This was always kind of the cheat code to making sure that your kids do reasonably well in school. If there are ways that we can lower that burden, that cost, that's what we're talking about. And my view is, if AI can start to do pieces of this, and even when I started making videos, people were like, hey, a lot of teachers just give lectures all day. Is that going to replace the teacher? And my answer has always been, if the teacher is defining themselves purely by the lecture giver, then yes, I do think that can be substituted now, because on-demand videos can be paused, repeated, et cetera. But if the teachers, and I remember in the early days of Khan Academy, and this wasn't a threat, this was more of a provocation for creativity. I remember a head of school once told their faculty, what do you do that Khan Academy doesn't do? And it's not a threat, it's saying that you're now liberated. You're now liberated to do more things. And a lot of great teachers always indexed on Socratic dialogue or doing a simulation or having kids work in breakouts and then get together and then present something. And that's the type of thing that Khan Academy, Khanmigo isn't going to be able to do. And even if we can approximate certain elements of that for the young girl in Afghanistan, being part of a community of people and peers that push you to make you better, I think that's going to be invaluable. Once again, we're going to try to approximate some of that with Schoolhouse, where it's real people, but to be in the same room, to be in the same community. We have a school 2 miles down the road, Khan Lab School, and if you visit the school, it's a very in-person school with lower student-teacher ratios than I think almost any other school in the area. If you visit, you'll see more human-to-human interaction than I think you see almost at any school. And people are surprised. They're like, wait, this is the school? Like, I thought I was going to see kids on computers. No, because we're able to use Khan Academy, because kids have access to Khanmigo, we don't have to waste class time on that. So a lot of that stuff happens independently. We hold kids accountable to their goals. But so most of class time is, what are you doing with the human beings in the room? And it's not just about the teacher to the students. We have students who are teaching. Some of our top teachers are juniors and seniors who are teaching advanced courses in philosophy and differential equations and things like that. So it's all about, how do you create a community to do interesting things?
I think sometimes with all this conversation about software and testing, that sort of thing, grades, people forget that one of the primary jobs of learning institutions, and for that matter, parents, is to teach human beings how to be civilized as we understand it today.
No, and it's interesting because I think most of us understand that implicitly, like, oh, you need to go to school to like get socialized a little bit. And look, honestly, not all of the socialization is positive.
Oh, by definition,
I have some memories
yeah.
from middle school. But a lot of nervous laughter. But the thing is about traditional schools, if you look at the Common Core standards or any state standards, they don't list any of these things anywhere. They don't list, like, in 7th grade, you should learn to deal with adversity, or you should learn to not project your insecurities onto, you know, the weakest kid in the room, or whatever. It doesn't say these things. You hopefully sometimes learn these things implicitly. And if once again, you can offload more of it to Khan Academy, Khanmigo, and it's more efficacious, then hopefully teachers and communities and students can spend more time building some of these skills.
Purva asks, how do you think we can leverage Gen AI tools like Khanmigo to help neurodiverse learners with learning disabilities or ADHD, for example?
Yeah, and I'll make a disclaimer. We haven't done any formal studies on it. We haven't even made specific designs for that. Anecdotally, well before Khanmigo, we heard stories, especially students with dyslexia really appreciated like the videos, pause, repeat. And it was interesting because, and this was just me doing it, like writing things out and talking out loud, but we heard anecdotally that people appreciated that versus just seeing type show up or slides come up, seeing someone organically write something. Recently, there's a district in Florida, this is anecdotal again, not a study, where there's a special needs teacher who works with students with Asperger's, and she immediately saw that the students with Asperger's were like going deep with the AI. Like they were spending a lot of time, and her initial fear was that these students were going to get even more isolated socially because of this. But this is what she told me, anecdotal. She said the opposite happened, that the students were able to communicate so much with the AI that they learned to express themselves better, and that she observed that they were more confident talking to their peers. That's anecdotal, but I think that at least gives us a glimpse of the directions that we might be able to start moving in, especially as AI becomes more multimodal. You know, if you imagine a student who might have trouble connecting with people or making eye contact, if it can give a little bit of feedback on like, hey, I know you're here for me, but why don't you try making eye contact? It'll mean a lot more for me. That type of training, right now, the only way to get that is with very expensive specialists and things like that. I think we might be able to make a dent. Once again, I don't want to make a claim that it will replace, but most people don't have access to these things. And so if it becomes at least an added support, it could be really useful.
Well, along those lines, Tanya asks, if you were to redesign the school system from scratch, what would it look like?
So I have thought about this. And I've even pitched to a few governments and ministries of education, and honestly, this is something we're working on. I would move wholesale to what I would call a competency-based system versus what we have today, which is I would call a seat time-based system. And no one really questions this because it's how we all grew up. But even if you look here in California, and if you look at the University of California system, if you look at what they call the A to G requirements, which are the requirements to apply to the University of California system, it says stuff like 3 years of math, 1 year has to be geometry, 2 or 3 years of foreign language, 3 or 4 years of English. It doesn't say you really need to be able to write at this level. You really should have mastered algebra. It doesn't say that. It says you needed to have sat in a chair in these classes called algebra, geometry. And even though it says that, at the California community colleges, 60 to 70% of the kids who show up, they've all met the A to G requirements. 60 to 70% when they take that math placement test, even though they sat in the classes called Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2, some of them even took pre-calculus and calculus, when they take that placement exam, it puts them in remedial math. 60 to 70%, the majority.
I think I represent that.
Perhaps. But remedial math is a euphemism for 7th grade math. They're saying that you're not even ready to learn algebra yet. So it shows you how the seat time-based system is really failing people. And you'll see the same thing with the writing requirement. Kids aren't even writing at a middle school level, even though they're sitting all the way through English 3, English 4 at a high school level.
It's almost like prison, time served.
It's time served.
Yeah.
And even that, I should argue, should be competency-based too. Like, have you repented? Have you reformed? But it's easier to measure competency in math than whether you've repented. And maybe AI can help there, but so first my answer is move to a competency-based system. And the power of that is, right, beyond just making sure that people know the material. Right now we too often equate time and speed with intelligence. And I point out, like, what should matter, if calculus, and we can debate whether calculus is needed for college admissions or a job, but if people think it is, it shouldn't matter whether it took you 2 weeks to learn it or 2 years to learn it. It should matter whether you learned it and whether you can apply it, and that's true of any field. And I think this is going to be even more important as we go into this AI world. There's going to be job dislocation. The biggest employer of men globally between ages 18 and 55 is driving a vehicle. That's likely to go away in the next 10, 15 years. The second largest employer globally is retail of some kind, running a cashier, stocking shelves. That's likely to go away, working in warehouses, et cetera. What are all those people going to do? If you have a competency-based system where not only can people learn what they need, but they can prove what they know, and it doesn't matter if you're 16 or you're 60, and if you can prove what you know, you get access to co-ops, internships, opportunities. That to me is going to be a much better system and a much more equitable system. Because right now, if you make a few mistakes when you're 16, 17, or you drop out of college and now you're 30 and you have a family, it's very hard to move back into the system. So that'd be first and foremost. Once you have the competency base, then I would say, well, what are the competencies that really matter? And that's where we would have to, okay, is it calculus or is it law and statistics? Maybe calculus for certain fields. Maybe we should. I talked to a person at a large pharmaceutical company who hires 30,000 salespeople in Africa. And I was talking about this competency. He's like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't just require a college degree because that's seat time. And I'm like, do you see any correlation? I was like, no. The best salespeople are just good salespeople. They know how to communicate. They know how to sell. And I was like, well, so it sounds like there's a different set of competencies you should look for than whether they majored in whatever at some four-year university. And so, yes, I would then work with the consumers of the competency. It doesn't have to be industry. It could be academia. It could be as a democracy. We want everyone to have some basic level of civics, some basic level of analytical reasoning. And so you put those together to define the competencies, and then let the world, the Khan Academies of the world, and other people figure out what's the best way to get people to those competencies.
You've mentioned driving going away, possibly retail sales. What about teachers?
So I'm very confident, and I was, it's hard. Any of these think tank pieces coming out, but I got some validation that I forgot which think tank it was. They recently said the jobs most likely to be disrupted by AI and least likely to get disrupted by AI. And it actually was very close to what I just said. The ones that are most likely to get disrupted by AI, driving a vehicle, basic analysis. If you're some kind of like a copyright editor, call centers, there's going to be, and look, there's whole countries where, Philippines, Indonesia, where there's, huge industries, so there's big questions. The ones that they listed as least likely, and I think the theme here is heavily human-centric jobs. And teachers was number 1 or number 2 of least likely to be disrupted by AI. And that is because they are essential for holding students accountable, keeping them motivated, keeping them connected to a group of students. If a student is suitably motivated, they could power through a textbook 50 years ago and learn a ton. And look, maybe many of the people here did do that. And even if you were capable of doing that, you still would have lost a lot by not having teachers that believe in you, that support you, that can help you navigate this very complex world. But most students can't navigate, just through a textbook, and they need that accountability and they need that support. And look, I was one of those kids who liked reading textbooks, but I too, if most of the step changes in my own self-perception were times where a teacher took me aside, looked into my eyes, and said, "Sal, that's really good. You like to draw? Maybe you should do more of that." Or, hey, have you thought about joining the Quiz Bowl team? That could be really good for you. I think you'll be good at it. And it's more than just joining Quiz Bowl. It was more that that teacher saw something in me. I'm like, oh yeah, maybe I can do that.
So then how do you envision teaching changing, evolving in the next 5 to 8 years? Because obviously, if more and more students, even in reasonably, relatively deprived areas and countries, have access to a phone, to the internet, they have access to Conmigo and other programs like it.
Yeah, the way I think about it is, once again, take a step back from the technology and think about what the problems that the technology is solving, and then think about how the job will evolve. So I tell every teacher, especially when I can sense there's a little bit trepidation around AI, put AI aside, imagine your school district just discovered like an asteroid of gold, billions of dollars, and they said, hey teachers, we're willing to hire 4 or 5 tireless teaching assistants, tutors for your class. They're going to be available in your classroom. They're going to be available. They're going to be on call for the students at home. They can help you with lesson planning, grading papers, writing progress reports, help you manage the parents a little bit. They can help you, the students, and they'll tell you what the students are up to, give more transparency. Teachers, don't you want that? And every teacher would say, yes, please. The college professors, the fancy, they've had that forever. I want that now. And so how would your job change if you had that? Well, okay, I would spend less time lesson planning and all of that. I'd spend more time managing this tireless group of TAs. I would probably be able to create richer lesson plans. I'd probably be able to create things that are more interactive in the classroom. If the kids need a mini lesson, the TA could go there and give them the mini lesson. I can elevate from there. I can get to be the grand architect. I can start to design some really beautiful simulations or Socratic dialogues, et cetera, et cetera. And I think most teachers would be very excited. Or I could sit down next to students while all of this is happening and form these personal connections. I think every teacher is like, that's why I went into the job. I didn't get into the job to be grading English papers for 17 hours at a stretch and things like that. And I'm like, well, that's what I think AI is going to do for you. And I think it's actually in some ways going to be able to be even more powerful. On the schoolhouse.world tutoring platform, we're experimenting with the AI being able to give the tutors feedback on what they could have done better during the tutoring session. We're about a year away from giving the tutors real-time feedback, like, hey, you haven't called on Myra. Or actually, to Myra's question, here's an example problem right now that will address her question. Or, hey, this student looks a little disengaged. Maybe you want to ask them this. And that, once again, very valuable. At Khan Academy, I have to raise a lot of money. We have a lot of funders. When I walk into a room at there's 2 or 3 people on our team say, Sal, make sure you talk to that person. They gave $1 million last year, but they didn't give any money this year. I know they're excited about female education in Afghanistan. Tell them that story. I'm like, oh, thank you. Okay, and I'll go tell that story. I think teachers could use that type of support when they're working with 30 students and trying to really connect with them and personalize.
Well, on that hopeful note, at least for the teachers in the room, Sal, thank you for a terrific conversation. This has really been wonderful.
Thank you.
Now, don't move your butts from those seats. I want you to join us in welcoming the Computer History Museum's President and CEO, Daniel Lewin, to close out tonight's program. He's been at the helm of this museum since 2018, and he's retiring in early April. So let's give him a warm round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks for what you do. Thank you. I didn't know they were going to say that, but it was very, very nice. Thank you. I do have a few things that I'd like to say in closing. How many people here had a special teacher in their life? Yeah. I had a teacher when I was in 2nd grade that taught me binary. That was a long time ago. And I ended up here. So I remember her every day. And I think what Sal is doing and what Rachel and Sal, let's give them another round of applause. Thanks for that. It really matters, and we're on the brink of major change, and I think you witnessed a wonderful conversation that speaks to the opportunity and the issues. That's exactly a fundamental component of this institution's mission and purpose. There'll be another event coming up on AI on March 25th. It'll be about the great chatbot debate. Do LLMs really understand? And if you haven't seen the exhibit downstairs, we'll encourage you to take a look there before you come to that program. AI researcher, a gentleman named Sebastian Bubeck, will debate AI critic Emily Bender, who's moderated by the IEEE Spectrum's Eliza Strickland. So that'll be a really nice program. I think they're going to pop up the survey code again. I'll look for your feedback. The institution, as I said, is a learning institution. And so your feedback is absolutely appreciated. It is monitored. And it helps us support and ask our donors to respond to the kinds of questions that were just recently teed up for Sal, which is that person gave us $1 million last year. Let's not forget about them. I want to thank Rachel and Sal. As I said earlier, I got to meet Sal a long, long time ago. As he was doing all of his work out of the closet in his home in Mountain View, and now it's a worldwide and world-class institution. He's an entrepreneur beyond compare, and he's focused on an area that is so fundamental to the human condition, which is what this institution's all about. I'd like to quote a professor from Stanford who was on stage a little bit ago, Professor Kennedy. He's a historian. And he makes the point, as I said earlier, that history is not about the past. He says, everything has history. It's an imperfect guide to the future and the only mirror and measuring rod that we have for the present. So as you witness this conversation and you start to see what this institution is trying to do to bring forward these types of conversation, it's on the shoulders of the equipment and the material that's in the collection. As you know, I said to the trustees a long time ago, CHM, Computer History Museum, but many of you have heard me say this, I like to say CHM is computing humanity and meaning. And the fundamental question is, what does it mean to be human in a world that doesn't exist without computing? Because if we pull the plug and the electricity goes off, we will all go away very quickly. Indigenous people will rise up and there'll be a new world. But we are so dependent upon this that we need to put these tools to work for the greater good. And I'm now going to quote Sal in my closing because I think his insights are prescient. And when we made the change at this institution from the fundamental mission, which we still embody, which is to collect and preserve for posterity the stories and the artifacts of the information age, we asked a number of people, about a dozen notable people, Sal being one of those at the top of the list, about what they thought when we teed up the new mission, which is to decode technology, the computing past, the digital present, and the future implications on the human condition. Because we live in the digital present. There's just no question about it. What Sal said is the following. The Computer History Museum is unique in where it is and what it focuses on. I'm not aware of any other museum quite like it. I see it as the real cultural hub of Silicon Valley. We in Silicon Valley have the opportunity and agency to reshape the nature of democracy, of speech, of art, of humanity. We should be exploring all of that right here. And I can't imagine a better place suited to it than CHM. So with that in mind, I'm so pleased that this is the last forum that I'll have, and I'm not pleased that it's my last one. I'm not going to give up on the museum. I'll be participating and supporting in an advisory role for quite some time. But you know, as a program to be able to introduce and close, this is a really special one because it really speaks to the heart of the reason why the museum exists. And if it motivates you, go to the website. I have to ask. Join and Give is how you can become a member, or you could choose to participate financially to keep the museum alive and living. So thank you all for coming. Please go downstairs, join Sal. He'll autograph your book. So thank you.
That's our bass player from Macon, Georgia, Gerald Jamont. And now we need a pound of fat